Why did the Chinese Empire really fall? For more than 2,000 years, China was not just a state, but a living idea, a civilization that believed it had discovered the perfect order of the world. Dynasties rose and fell, yet the empire itself always returned, stronger, wiser, and seemingly eternal. Emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven, officials governed through ancient laws, and millions accepted that China was the center of all human civilization. From the outside, it looked unbreakable. From the inside, however, the fall had already begun long before the final collapse. The Chinese Empire did not fall in a single moment of fire or invasion. It unraveled slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, while life continued as normal. Farmers still tilled their fields, scholars still memorized Confucian texts, and emperors still sat on the dragon throne, believing the world was under control. But beneath this surface of stability, the empire was rotting from pressures it could no longer manage. Population exploded beyond what the land could support, turning abundance into scarcity. Bureaucracy grew so massive that decisions took months or years, while crises demanded immediate action. Corruption spread quietly through official ranks, transforming laws into tools for personal gain rather than justice. The mandate of heaven, once a moral bond between ruler and people, became an empty ritual used to justify failure instead of prevent it. Nature itself seemed to turn against the empire as floods, droughts, and famines struck with increasing frequency, each disaster interpreted as a warning that heaven was losing patience. Yet the court dismissed these signs as temporary misfortune, refusing to admit that the system itself was breaking. While Europe industrialized and modernized, China clung to traditions that had once made it great, but now held it back. Foreign powers knocked at its gates, not with armies at first, but with trade, technology, and demands the empire did not understand and refused to accept. The Chinese Empire believed time was on its side, that the world would eventually return to its natural order with China at the center. That belief would prove fatal, because when change finally arrived, it came too fast, too violently, and too completely. The real story of China's fall is not about defeat, but about denial. An empire so confident in its eternity that it failed to notice the moment it became fragile. And by the time that realization came, the empire that had ruled for millennia was already beyond saving. The collapse of the Chinese Empire did not begin with foreign armies or gunboats on the coast. It began with a simple but dangerous illusion: the belief that the system was perfect and therefore untouchable. For centuries, the imperial structure had survived wars, rebellions, and natural disasters, reinforcing the idea that it could survive anything. This confidence slowly turned into blindness. The emperor was surrounded by officials who owed their positions not to competence, but to loyalty, family ties, and bribes. Reports sent to the capital were filtered, softened, or entirely rewritten to protect careers. Peasants starved in the provinces while the court debated poetry, rituals, and protocol. The examination system, once designed to select the brightest minds, became a rigid machine that rewarded memorization over innovation.
talented reformers were silenced, ignored, or punished for challenging tradition. At the same time, China's population grew faster than its economy. Land was divided into smaller and smaller plots, forcing families into debt and desperation. A single flood or drought could destroy entire regions, yet relief arrived too late or not at all. Banditry increased, secret societies formed, and rebellions simmered beneath the surface. Each uprising was crushed, but the causes remained. The empire treated symptoms, never the disease. Meanwhile, the world beyond China was changing rapidly. Industrialization transformed warfare, trade, and power. Steamships, modern artillery, and global markets reshaped international relations. China watched these changes with suspicion, convinced that foreign knowledge threatened moral order rather than strengthened it. When Western powers demanded trade access, the empire responded with restriction instead of adaptation. This resistance did not preserve sovereignty, it exposed weakness. Military defeats against technologically superior enemies shattered the myth of invincibility. For the first time, ordinary Chinese people saw that heaven might no longer favor the dynasty. Faith in the mandate began to crack. Once that belief weakened, loyalty followed. Officials hesitated, soldiers deserted, and peasants questioned why they should obey rulers who could no longer protect them. The empire was still standing, but its foundation was fractured. Every decision delayed, every reform blocked, and every warning ignored pushed China closer to a point where recovery would no longer be possible. The fall was no longer a question of if, but when.
As the cracks inside the empire widened, pressure from the outside intensified. Foreign powers no longer viewed China as a distant civilization to respect, but as a vast market to exploit. Trade imbalances drained silver from the economy, destabilizing local markets and collapsing traditional systems of exchange. Opium flooded the country, despite imperial bans, spreading addiction through cities and villages alike. The state, unable to stop the trade or care for its victims, lost moral authority. When officials attempted enforcement, corruption undermined every effort. Bribes ensured that ships passed inspections and warehouses stayed untouched. The Opium Wars exposed a terrifying reality. The empire's military, once feared across Asia, was obsolete. Cannons shattered wooden junks, disciplined troops collapsed before modern formations, and humiliating treaties followed defeat. Ports were forced open, territories ceded, and foreign enclaves carved into Chinese soil. These concessions were not just economic losses, they were psychological wounds. Each treaty announced to the people that the emperor could no longer defend the realm. In the countryside, rumors spread faster than official decrees. Some claimed heaven had abandoned the dynasty, others believed the end times were near. Charismatic leaders exploited this fear, promising salvation, equality, or divine justice. Massive rebellions erupted, the most devastating, draining millions of lives and crippling entire regions. The imperial army, stretched thin and poorly supplied, relied increasingly on local militias loyal not to the throne but to regional commanders. This shift quietly dismantled central authority. Power fragmented as generals and governors learned they could rule independently. The court attempted reform, but every change arrived too late or was reversed by conservative factions. Railways, factories, and modern schools were discussed endlessly, yet built cautiously, if at all. The empire tried to modernize without changing its core, to evolve without transforming. This contradiction proved fatal. Each failed reform deepened public frustration. Students, merchants, and even officials began to question whether the dynasty itself was the problem. Newspapers spread new ideas, exposing corruption and comparing China's weakness to foreign strength. The emperor became a distant symbol, disconnected from daily suffering. What had once been a unified civilization guided by tradition now felt directionless. The empire still existed on maps, but in the minds of its people, it was already fading. The fall was accelerating, driven not by a single enemy, but by 1,000 unresolved failures collapsing inward.
As faith in the dynasty eroded, a deeper transformation was taking place beneath the surface of society. New generations were growing up in a China that no longer felt timeless or eternal. Western ideas entered through treaty ports, missionary schools, and translated books, introducing concepts that challenged centuries of imperial thought. Ideas about nationalism, constitutional government, science, and individual rights spread quietly at first, then faster as printing presses multiplied. Young scholars who once memorized classical texts now asked dangerous questions about power, legitimacy, and the role of the emperor. Many concluded that China's weakness was not accidental but systemic. The civil service examinations, once the backbone of government, were increasingly seen as outdated rituals disconnected from real leadership. Talented minds were trapped, reciting ancient poetry while the world outside advanced rapidly. When reforms finally abolished the exams, it shocked the nation, not as a solution, but as proof that the old order was collapsing. Meanwhile, natural disasters intensified suffering. Floods, famines, and droughts struck already fragile regions, and the state failed to respond effectively. Relief funds vanished into corrupt networks, leaving villages to starve. Each disaster reinforced the belief that heaven's mandate had been withdrawn. Secret societies flourished, offering protection, identity, and hope where the government provided none. Some preached radical equality, others vengeance against foreigners, others total destruction of the old world. Violence became normalized. The imperial court reacted with confusion, alternating between repression and concession, satisfying no one. Foreign powers intervened repeatedly, demanding compensation, privileges, and influence. Railways, mines, and factories fell under foreign control, deepening resentment. Yet resistance often backfired, provoking harsher retaliation and further humiliation. The empire became a battleground of interests it could no longer manage. Regional leaders gained unprecedented autonomy, collecting taxes, raising armies, and negotiating with outsiders independently. The emperor's authority was now symbolic at best. Even within the palace, factions plotted endlessly, prioritizing survival over reform. Attempts at constitutional monarchy arrived too late, met with skepticism by reformers and fear by conservatives. Trust had evaporated. Intellectuals openly discussed revolution not as a fantasy, but as necessity. Pamphlets circulated, calling for an end to imperial rule, blaming centuries of stagnation for national humiliation. Soldiers, underpaid and disillusioned, listened closely. When uprisings broke out, many units refused to defend the dynasty. Some joined the rebels. The empire still stood, but its foundations were hollow. What remained was not a collapse caused by invasion or a single event, but a slow unraveling of belief. Once people stopped believing in the emperor, the empire became impossible to sustain. The end was no longer a question of if, but when.
By the early 20th century, the Chinese Empire existed in a strange state between survival and disappearance. On paper, the dynasty still ruled a vast land, but in reality, its power had fractured into countless competing forces. Provincial governors acted like independent rulers, warlords commanded personal armies, and foreign advisors shaped policy behind closed doors. The imperial court attempted to reclaim authority through sudden reforms, promising constitutions, assemblies, and modernization. Yet these promises felt hollow to a population that had watched decades of failure. Reformers saw the court as dishonest and incapable. Conservatives viewed change as betrayal, and ordinary people saw only chaos. The emperor, once a sacred figure, had become distant and irrelevant to daily life. Revolutionary movements grew bolder, no longer hiding in secrecy, but organizing openly in cities and among overseas Chinese communities. Sun Yat-sen and others framed revolution not as destruction, but as rebirth, arguing that China could only survive by abandoning the imperial system entirely. Their message resonated deeply with students, merchants, and soldiers alike. Railways and telegraphs, symbols of modernization, also became tools of rebellion, allowing ideas to spread faster than imperial control. When mutinies erupted within the army, they revealed the dynasty's fatal weakness. Soldiers no longer fought for the emperor, they fought for pay, for local leaders, or for revolutionary ideals. The imperial court attempted to suppress unrest, but orders were ignored or delayed. Each failed response encouraged further rebellion. Cities declared independence one by one, not out of coordination at first, but from shared exhaustion. The empire was no longer feared. Foreign powers watched carefully, prepared to protect their interests regardless of who ruled China. This knowledge further undermined imperial legitimacy. If outsiders did not respect the emperor, why should the people? The final attempts to save the dynasty came in the form of desperate compromises, appointing reform-minded officials, negotiating with revolutionaries, even offering shared power. But it was too late. Trust could not be rebuilt once broken so completely. The idea of empire itself had lost meaning. When the final abdication came, it was met not with shock, but with quiet acceptance. There was no dramatic siege, no final battle worthy of legend. Instead, the empire faded out of existence, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. What followed was uncertainty, conflict, and new struggles, but the old world was gone forever. The fall of the Chinese Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a long erosion of belief, authority, and purpose. It fell because it could no longer adapt fast enough to a world that had already moved on. After the abdication of the last emperor, many believed the story of the Chinese Empire had finally ended. Yet its shadow continued to shape everything that followed. The fall did not bring immediate unity or peace, because the empire had been the only structure holding the vast land together. Without it, China fractured further. Former imperial officials reinvented themselves as republicans. Warlords filled the vacuum of power, and revolutionary leaders struggled to turn ideals into functioning governance.
This chaotic aftermath revealed another reason the empire had truly fallen long before its official end. It had failed to prepare a successor system. For centuries, loyalty to the emperor had replaced loyalty to institutions. Once the emperor was gone, there was nothing stable beneath him. The army split into competing factions, each claiming to defend China while tearing it apart. Provinces became personal territories, ruled by force rather than law. Ordinary people who had hoped the end of the dynasty would bring relief, instead faced continued taxation, conscription, and violence. In hindsight, this suffering exposed the final weakness of imperial rule. The empire had survived by centralizing authority, but it had never allowed local governance to mature independently. When central authority vanished, collapse was inevitable. Foreign powers deepened their influence during this period, supporting different factions to protect trade routes, ports, and resources. China's sovereignty, already weakened under the empire, eroded even further. Intellectuals looked back at the imperial past with a mix of shame and nostalgia, debating whether the empire had been a source of stability or stagnation. Many concluded that the problem was not just the last dynasty, but the imperial system itself, which resisted change until change became impossible. The fall of the Chinese empire thus became a warning etched into history. It showed that longevity does not guarantee resilience, and tradition can become a prison when adaptation is delayed too long. The empire did not fall because of one rebellion, one foreign invasion, or one weak ruler. It fell because it could no longer command belief in a world transformed by industry, nationalism, and global power. Its end marked not only the collapse of a dynasty, but the end of an entire way of understanding authority, identity, and civilization in China.
As China moved deeper into the 20th century, the absence of the empire became more visible than its presence had ever been. The imperial system had once defined time, hierarchy, and meaning itself, and without it, the country struggled to answer a simple question: who now spoke for China? Competing visions emerged everywhere. Some believed salvation lay in Western-style democracy, others in authoritarian nationalism, and some in radical revolution. This ideological fragmentation was not accidental. It was the delayed consequence of centuries of imperial control over thought. The empire had discouraged political experimentation, fearing that new ideas would weaken imperial authority. When the system finally collapsed, suppressed ideas exploded all at once, colliding violently. Schools, newspapers, and universities became battlegrounds of ideology. Young intellectuals rejected Confucian obedience, blaming it for China's weakness, while older generations clung to imperial values as the last anchor of identity. Meanwhile, rural China remained largely untouched by these debates, trapped in poverty and traditional structures that the empire had never reformed. This divide between city and countryside widened instability. Warlords recruited peasants with promises of protection or survival, further militarizing society. Each conflict, each broken promise, traced its roots back to the imperial failure to modernize land ownership, taxation, and representation.
Even the military reflected imperial decay. Once loyal to the throne, it now served whoever could pay or intimidate it. Discipline eroded, corruption spread, and violence became normalized. Foreign observers often described China as chaotic, but this chaos was not sudden. It was the echo of an empire that had ruled by suppression rather than integration. By prioritizing order over participation, the imperial system had prevented the emergence of civic responsibility. When order collapsed, there was no shared framework to replace it. The empire had fallen not only politically, but psychologically. The people had been taught to obey, not to govern. In this vacuum, radical movements gained strength, offering clarity, purpose, and a new kind of authority. These movements did not arise despite the empire, but because of it. The Chinese Empire's final legacy was not its palaces or ceremonies, but the unstable transition it left behind. Its fall reshaped China's destiny by forcing the nation to reinvent itself from the ruins of an ancient system that could no longer survive in the modern world. As new ideologies filled the vacuum left by the empire, China entered a period where survival often mattered more than loyalty or belief. The old imperial promise had been simple: obedience in exchange for stability. When that promise collapsed, people searched desperately for anything that could restore meaning and security. Nationalist leaders tried to resurrect a unified China by invoking history, symbols, and a shared sense of humiliation inflicted by foreign powers. Yet these efforts were haunted by contradiction. They spoke of renewal while inheriting institutions designed for imperial control rather than popular participation. Laws were passed, flags were raised, speeches were delivered. But beneath the surface, the same structural weaknesses remained. Bureaucracy still served elites, corruption persisted, and rural poverty deepened. At the same time, revolutionary movements grew stronger by positioning themselves as the opposite of the empire. They rejected emperors, traditions, and Confucian hierarchies, promising equality and justice. For many peasants, this was the first time anyone had spoken directly to them as political actors, rather than subjects. The empire's failure to integrate the countryside into national life now returned as a powerful force. Millions who had once been invisible became the foundation of revolutionary change. Violence escalated as competing visions fought not just for power, but for the right to define China's future. Civil war was not merely a struggle between factions, it was the final stage of imperial collapse, played out decades after the throne had vanished. Every battle reflected unresolved imperial questions: who owned the land, who held authority, and whose lives mattered. Even culture became a battlefield. Ancient texts were criticized, temples destroyed, rituals mocked as reformers tried to sever China from its imperial past. Yet the shadow of the empire remained unavoidable. Centralized control, mass mobilization, and reverence for authority reappeared in new forms, proving how deeply imperial habits had shaped political behavior. The empire had fallen, but its methods survived. What changed was the justification. Where emperors once ruled by divine mandate, new leaders ruled by ideology, nationalism, or revolution. The transformation was profound, but not complete.
China's long imperial history had trained the population to endure hardship under centralized power, making rapid, sweeping change possible. In this sense, the empire's collapse did not end China's authoritarian tradition, it transformed it. The fall of the Chinese Empire was not a clean break between old and new, but a long, painful evolution. Its true end came not with the abdication of the last emperor, but when a new system finally succeeded in filling the void left behind. Only then did the empire truly fall, not in name, but in function and memory. As the new regime tightened its grip on China, the legacy of the empire was both rejected and quietly absorbed. The rulers spoke the language of revolution, but the machinery they inherited had been forged over centuries of imperial rule. Census systems, grain collection, internal surveillance, and rigid administrative divisions were not inventions of the modern state, but echoes of dynasties long gone. What had once served emperors now served party leaders. The difference was not in structure, but in narrative. Where emperors claimed the mandate of heaven, the new state claimed historical inevitability. Yet the psychology of rule remained strikingly familiar. Obedience was still expected, dissent still punished, unity still enforced at any cost. For ordinary people, the change felt less like liberation and more like a shift in symbols. Portraits replaced dragons, slogans replaced edicts, but the distance between ruler and ruled remained vast. This continuity reveals an uncomfortable truth about the fall of the Chinese Empire. It did not fail because centralized power was rejected, but because it failed to adapt fast enough. The empire collapsed not when people stopped believing in authority, but when they stopped believing in imperial authority specifically. The desire for order never disappeared. It simply searched for a new container. Foreign observers often misunderstand this transition, framing it as a sudden ideological awakening. But within China, it felt like the closing of one long chapter and the opening of another written in the same language of control and sacrifice. The empire had trained society to endure scarcity, hierarchy, and discipline, traits that now fueled massive campaigns of transformation. Land reforms, industrial drives, and social engineering on an unprecedented scale became possible precisely because imperial obedience had normalized suffering in the name of a greater future. Ironically, the empire's endurance became the foundation of its replacement. But this continuity came at a cost. The unresolved traumas of imperial collapse resurfaced repeatedly in moments of crisis. Famines, purges, and political upheavals echoed earlier dynastic collapses, following the same cycle of overreach, repression, and recovery. Each time, the memory of imperial stability haunted the population, even as leaders insisted the past was dead. The fall of the empire, therefore, was not a single historical event, but a recurring process, replayed whenever power became disconnected from the people it governed. China did not escape its imperial history, it internalized it, and in doing so, it ensured that the fall of the empire would shape its future as much as its past.
As decades passed, historians began to see the fall of the Chinese Empire not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow transformation disguised as destruction. Unlike Rome, China was not erased by invasion, nor did it vanish into fragmentation forever. Instead, it dissolved into a different form of itself. The imperial idea survived even after the emperor disappeared. This is why the question of why the Chinese empire really fell cannot be answered by pointing to a single rebellion, war, or foreign power. The empire fell because its core promise broke down. For centuries, the state had offered stability in exchange for obedience, prosperity in exchange for loyalty, and cosmic order in exchange for sacrifice. When that bargain failed, everything else followed. By the late imperial period, population pressure had stretched land to its limits. Peasants worked harder for less, while elites insulated themselves from hardship. Natural disasters, once interpreted as warnings from heaven, became constant reminders that the system no longer protected its people. Corruption eroded trust, but more damaging was the sense that the center no longer understood the periphery. Orders flowed downward, but reality did not flow back up. Officials reported what emperors wanted to hear, not what was true. This information blindness crippled decision-making and turned manageable crises into catastrophes. Meanwhile, exposure to the outside world shattered the illusion that China was the unquestioned center of civilization. Defeats by smaller, technologically advanced powers humiliated the court and exposed the empire's stagnation. Reformers attempted to save the system by modernizing it, but every reform threatened entrenched interests that depended on the old order. The result was paralysis. The empire could neither remain what it was nor become what it needed to be. In this space between past and future, legitimacy evaporated. When revolution finally came, it succeeded not because it was overwhelmingly powerful, but because the empire was already hollow. The fall, therefore, was not a moment of chaos, but a moment of release. The structure collapsed because belief had collapsed first. People no longer saw the emperor as the bridge between heaven and earth. He became just another distant ruler, incapable of solving real problems. This loss of sacred authority was fatal. Empires can survive poverty, invasion, and rebellion, but they cannot survive disbelief. Once the mandate of heaven was no longer felt in daily life, the empire had already fallen, even if its institutions still stood. The final lesson of China's imperial collapse is that endurance can become a weakness. The longer a system lasts, the harder it becomes to imagine alternatives, and the more devastating its eventual failure will be.
In the years after the imperial system weakened beyond repair, China entered a period where the absence of the emperor felt more confusing than liberating. For centuries, people had oriented their lives around the rhythms of imperial rule. Festivals, taxes, examinations, and rituals that connected villages to the throne. When that center vanished, nothing immediately replaced it. This vacuum revealed another hidden reason the Chinese empire fell. It had centralized meaning as much as power. Without the emperor, there was no shared story explaining why society functioned as it did. Regional leaders, warlords, and reformers rushed to fill the gap, each offering a different vision of China's future. Some promised a return to ancient virtues, others preached radical modernization, and some simply seized territory and ruled by force. The empire's collapse unleashed energies that had been suppressed for generations. Social mobility increased, but so did violence and uncertainty. Education, once tied to Confucian ideals and imperial service, fractured into competing ideologies.
Loyalty shifted from dynasty to faction, from throne to ideology, from tradition to survival. Foreign influence intensified this fragmentation. Ideas from Europe, Japan, and Russia flooded into China, challenging everything from family structure to political authority. The empire's system had been designed to filter and absorb change slowly, but now change arrived faster than institutions could adapt. Attempts to restore order through republican structures struggled because they inherited the same problems as the empire without its symbolic unity. Meanwhile, ordinary people experienced the fall not as a single event, but as a prolonged erosion of certainty. Taxes changed, armies passed through towns, currencies lost value, and rules shifted constantly. This instability made many nostalgic for the empire, even as they recognized it could never return. In this sense, the fall of the Chinese empire was tragic not because it ended, but because it ended without closure. There was no decisive final battle, no clear line between old and new. The imperial past lingered in habits, architecture, and memory, shaping the future long after the throne was gone. This lingering presence complicates the idea of collapse. China did not simply move on, it carried the empire within itself, struggling to redefine identity without abandoning history. The true collapse occurred when continuity became impossible, when tradition could no longer guide action and innovation lacked legitimacy. The empire fell because it could not resolve the tension between preservation and transformation. Every attempt to choose one over the other deepened the crisis. In the end, the imperial system did not fail from weakness alone, but from exhaustion. It had answered the same questions for too long in a world that had begun asking entirely new ones.
As the imperial structure faded in practical power, its moral authority dissolved more slowly, creating a dangerous imbalance between belief and reality. Many officials, scholars, and elders continued to think in imperial terms even when the empire no longer functioned. This mental lag became another reason the Chinese empire truly fell. It could not think its way out of its own decline. Confucian ideology had taught generations that harmony flowed from hierarchy, that order depended on everyone knowing their place, and that chaos was a sign of moral failure rather than systemic breakdown. When corruption spread, when famine returned again and again, and when foreign powers dictated terms, the system blamed individuals instead of structures. Officials were punished, emperors were criticized, but the framework itself was rarely questioned until it was too late. Reform movements emerged, yet they were trapped between reverence for tradition and fear of radical change. Even revolutionary thinkers struggled with this contradiction, often wrapping new ideas in ancient language to make them acceptable. Meanwhile, the population grew restless. Peasants who had endured centuries of hardship no longer believed suffering was temporary or divinely ordained. Rebellions became more frequent, not because people suddenly became rebellious, but because faith in imperial justice collapsed. When authority loses moral credibility, it must rely on force, and the Chinese Empire increasingly did exactly that. Armies were deployed internally more than externally, draining resources and deepening resentment. This militarization further separated the state from its people. The emperor, once imagined as the son of heaven, became distant
symbolic, and ineffective in daily life. At the same time, modern communication and transportation exposed China to different political systems that did not revolve around a single ruler. The empire was no longer the only imaginable form of order. Once that mental monopoly was broken, restoration became impossible. Even loyalists began to ask whether saving the dynasty was the same as saving the country. That question marked the true point of no return. When the survival of China and the survival of the empire ceased to be identical, the empire had already fallen in spirit. What followed was not sudden collapse, but a long unraveling, where symbols remained, while substance disappeared. The court still held ceremonies, but decisions mattered less. Laws were issued, but enforcement varied wildly. The empire became a shell inhabited by memories, rituals, and inertia. Its fall was therefore not an explosion, but an evaporation. Power leaked away quietly, absorbed by local authorities, foreign interests, and new ideologies. By the time the imperial title was officially abolished, the empire had already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The ending was formal, but the collapse had been unfolding for generations.
By the early 20th century, what remained of the Chinese empire was sustained more by habit than strength. Institutions continued to operate because they had always operated, not because they still commanded genuine authority. The court issued decrees that traveled slowly and were often ignored by provincial officials who ruled their regions like independent states. Governors raised their own armies, collected their own taxes, and negotiated with foreign powers without waiting for approval from the capital. This fragmentation was one of the empire's most fatal weaknesses. China had once survived because its central bureaucracy bound vast territories into a single system, but now that system had fractured into competing centers of power. Warlords filled the vacuum left by imperial decline, promising order while deepening chaos. Each claimed loyalty to China, yet few cared for the empire itself. Meanwhile, foreign influence penetrated deeper into everyday life. Railways, banks, factories, and ports increasingly operated under foreign control, creating parallel systems beyond imperial reach. Ordinary people began to associate modernity not with the emperor, but with outsiders. This association was humiliating and destabilizing. The empire no longer represented progress, protection, or prosperity. It represented delay. Intellectuals criticized the dynasty openly, arguing that imperial rule had become an obstacle rather than a foundation. Students organized protests, writers published manifestos, and secret societies prepared for rebellion. What united these movements was not a single ideology, but a shared conclusion: the empire could not be fixed. Attempts at reform arrived too late and went too far or not far enough. Constitutional promises were made, then diluted. Councils were formed, then controlled. Each half measure convinced more people that the dynasty was acting out of fear, not vision. Even within the court, factions disagreed violently about the future. Conservatives clung to tradition, reformers pushed for change, and opportunists sought personal survival. The emperor, isolated and constrained, symbolized this paralysis. No decision could satisfy all sides, and every delay weakened legitimacy further.
When revolution finally erupted, it spread not because it was perfectly organized, but because resistance had vanished. Soldiers defected, officials hesitated, cities declared independence from imperial rule with surprising ease. The empire did not fall in a climactic battle. It dissolved through non-compliance. People simply stopped obeying. This was perhaps the most revealing truth of the Chinese Empire's fall. Power existed only as long as people believed in it. Once belief disappeared, the vast machinery of imperial governance collapsed under its own weight. The final abdication was almost anticlimactic, a quiet acknowledgement of a reality already accepted by millions. The empire ended not with fire, but with a signature. And yet the consequences were immense. The collapse left behind uncertainty, fragmentation, and decades of struggle to redefine what China would become. The fall of the empire solved nothing immediately. It only cleared the stage. In that sense, the empire did not fall to make way for something better, but because it could no longer prevent change. The world had moved forward, and the imperial system, bound by its own history, could not move with it. After the abdication of the last emperor, many believed that the fall of the Chinese Empire marked the beginning of renewal. But what followed revealed how deeply imperial collapse had destabilized the country. Without the unifying authority of the throne, China entered a period where power existed everywhere and nowhere at once. The imperial system had once suppressed fragmentation through ritual, bureaucracy, and symbolism, but when it vanished, those mechanisms disappeared with it. Regional commanders transformed into warlords almost overnight, each ruling territory through force rather than legitimacy. These men claimed to protect the nation, yet their rivalries drained resources and destroyed trust. Railways became battle lines, cities changed hands repeatedly, and civilians learned that survival depended on loyalty shifting as quickly as armies moved. The dream of a unified republic struggled to compete with the reality of armed control. This chaos was not an accident of revolution, but a direct inheritance of imperial decline. The empire had centralized authority so completely that when it fell, no resilient local governance remained to replace it. Decades of bureaucratic obedience had discouraged independent institutions, leaving a vacuum that violence rushed to fill. Meanwhile, foreign powers continued to exert pressure, exploiting instability to expand economic and political influence. Loans came with conditions, advisors came with agendas, and sovereignty became negotiable. To many Chinese citizens, it felt as though the empire had fallen only to expose the nation to even greater vulnerability. Yet beneath this disorder, new ideas continued to spread. Political movements emerged that rejected both imperial rule and warlord domination, seeking a vision of China rooted in popular legitimacy rather than inherited authority. Universities became centers of debate, newspapers carried radical arguments, and students marched demanding national dignity. These movements drew strength from the failure of the empire, using its collapse as proof that tradition alone could not protect the country. The memory of imperial weakness became a warning rather than a comfort. At the same time, the cultural legacy of the empire remained deeply embedded in everyday life. Customs, language, family structures, and moral frameworks did not disappear with the throne. This contradiction defined the post-imperial era, a society shaped by centuries of empire struggling to imagine a future without one. The fall of the Chinese Empire therefore did not end history, it fractured it. Old loyalties persisted while new identities competed to replace them. The empire's collapse revealed that political systems can vanish faster than cultural habits, and that removing a ruler does not automatically create unity. In retrospect, the empire fell because it could no longer adapt, but what followed proved that adaptation is never simple. The chaos that succeeded imperial rule was not a failure of revolution alone, but the final consequence of centuries of rigid control finally breaking apart. China's long struggle after the empire would be shaped by this moment, a reminder that when an empire falls, its shadow remains long after its banners are lowered.
As the chaos of warlord rule spread across China, a deeper realization began to take hold among the population. The Chinese Empire had not fallen in a single moment of defeat, but through a long erosion of meaning. For centuries, the emperor had been more than a ruler. He was the symbolic axis around which the world was believed to turn. When that symbol collapsed, it left behind a psychological void as damaging as any military loss. Ordinary people struggled to understand where authority now came from and why obedience should matter at all. This uncertainty weakened social cohesion, making violence and opportunism easier to justify. The imperial system had demanded loyalty not because it was perfect, but because it claimed cosmic inevitability. Once that claim was broken, nothing could fully replace it. Attempts to revive imperial traditions failed because belief could not be restored by force. At the same time, modern ideologies promised solutions, but often ignored the realities of a society shaped by thousands of years of hierarchical rule. Revolutionary leaders spoke of equality and national rebirth, yet relied on centralized power structures eerily similar to those of the empire they rejected. This contradiction confused the population and deepened mistrust. Many citizens came to see all governments as distant and self-serving, a perception rooted in the late imperial experience of corruption and neglect. The fall of the empire had taught people that authority could collapse suddenly, and that survival required adaptability rather than loyalty. Meanwhile, the rural majority bore the heaviest burden of transition. Tax systems collapsed, banditry flourished, and famine followed political instability. Peasants who had once viewed the empire as an abstract but stable presence now experienced governance as unpredictable and brutal. In their eyes, the empire's end was not liberation, but abandonment. Yet, even in these harsh conditions, the seeds of transformation grew. Grassroots organizations formed to protect villages. Local leaders emerged based on trust rather than lineage, and new forms of social organization quietly replaced imperial structures. These developments revealed an irony at the heart of China's imperial collapse. The system fell because it could no longer adapt, but its fall forced adaptation at every level of society. The empire promised order through rigidity, but reality demanded flexibility.
Over time, this lesson reshaped political thinking across the country. Intellectuals and reformers began to argue that China's strength would come not from restoring past glory, but from confronting the reasons it failed. The empire had collapsed because it mistook permanence for stability and tradition for resilience. By refusing to evolve alongside a changing world, it turned its greatest strength, continuity, into its fatal weakness. The long aftermath of the empire's fall thus became a crucible in which modern China was forged, shaped not only by revolution and conflict, but by the slow understanding that no system survives simply because it has always existed.
As the memory of imperial rule faded into history, its shadow still shaped every attempt to rebuild China. The collapse of the empire had left behind institutions without legitimacy and traditions without authority, forcing the nation to confront a question it had avoided for centuries. What holds a society together when heaven no longer chooses its ruler? The old answer had been the mandate of heaven, a belief so powerful that it justified obedience even in times of hardship. Once foreign powers exposed the empire's weakness and internal decay proved undeniable, that mandate dissolved. No rebellion or invasion alone destroyed it. Disbelief did. People stopped seeing disasters as temporary signs of divine testing and began interpreting them as proof that the system itself was broken. This shift in mindset was revolutionary. It meant that rulers could now be judged not by tradition, but by results. Yet the transition was violent and uncertain, because centuries of imperial governance had trained society to look upward for solutions. When that vertical structure collapsed, chaos rushed in to fill the space. Competing visions of China's future emerged, each claiming to restore order in a different way. Some sought to revive Confucian ideals without emperors. Others embraced nationalism, socialism, or militarism. None could immediately replace the deep cultural glue once provided by imperial ritual and symbolism. This fragmentation prolonged instability and made unity difficult to achieve. The empire's fall had also severed the link between moral authority and political power. In the imperial era, corruption was condemned as a personal failure of officials, not as a flaw in the system itself. After the collapse, corruption became systemic, openly acknowledged, and often expected. This further eroded trust and reinforced the idea that no ruling structure was permanent. At the same time, the loss of the empire forced China to redefine its identity in a world dominated by nation-states rather than civilizations. For thousands of years, China had seen itself as the center of the world, with others orbiting around it. The fall shattered this worldview. China was no longer a timeless empire, but a vulnerable country competing for survival. This psychological shift was as profound as any military defeat. It compelled reformers to study foreign systems, adopt new technologies, and rethink governance from the ground up. Ironically, it was the empire's failure that opened the path to modernization. The rigid hierarchy that once ensured stability had become an obstacle to innovation, and its removal allowed new ideas to circulate freely, though often violently. The empire did not fall because China was weak. It fell because its strength was tied to a structure that could not bend. When pressure came from every direction at once, economic, military, ideological, the structure cracked instead of adapting. The long struggle that followed was not simply about replacing one government with another, but about rebuilding the foundations of authority, legitimacy, and collective belief. In this sense, the fall of the Chinese Empire was not an ending,
but a transformation stretched across generations, proving that the most powerful empires rarely die in battle. They dissolve when the world they were built to rule no longer exists.
So long after the last emperor stepped down, the habits of empire continued to influence everyday life, often in ways people barely noticed. Administrative thinking, social hierarchy, respect for authority, and the expectation of centralized control had been shaped over millennia and could not simply disappear with a decree. This lingering imperial mindset created a paradox. Even as the empire was gone, many still expected a new emperor in everything but name. When warlords rose, people followed them as local dynasts. When political movements promised unity and order, they were judged by the same standards once applied to emperors. Stability, harmony, and moral leadership were still the benchmarks of legitimacy. This made the post-imperial period especially volatile. Any government that failed to deliver order was quickly seen as having lost its mandate, even if the concept was no longer officially recognized. The collapse had trained society to believe that authority must be absolute to be effective, yet history had just proven the danger of absolute rigidity. This contradiction fueled repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. Each new regime claimed to have learned from the empire's mistakes, yet many recreated its structures under different names. Centralization returned because fragmentation felt unbearable. Ideology replaced ritual, and loyalty to the emperor was exchanged for loyalty to abstract ideals. In this way, the empire's fall did not erase imperial logic, it transformed it. The state remained the ultimate organizer of life, but its justification changed. Where emperors once ruled by cosmic order, modern rulers claimed to rule by historical necessity, popular will, or revolutionary destiny. The language evolved, but the underlying expectation of a powerful center endured. This continuity explains why the fall of the Chinese Empire cannot be understood as a clean break. It was not a sudden leap from tradition to modernity, but a painful negotiation between the two. Many reforms failed not because they were wrong, but because they collided with deeply ingrained assumptions about authority and obedience. Education systems, for example, struggled to replace classical learning with practical knowledge while still preserving moral discipline. Legal reforms aimed to introduce equality before the law, yet social habits favored personal relationships and informal hierarchy. These tensions slowed progress and created frustration, reinforcing the belief that something essential had been lost with the empire. At the same time, the absence of an emperor allowed space for voices that had never been heard before. Intellectuals, workers, peasants, and women increasingly participated in shaping the future. This expansion of participation was chaotic, but it marked a decisive departure from the imperial past. The empire had fallen not only because it failed to adapt, but because the world it governed had outgrown the limits of dynastic rule. Communication, trade, and ideas moved faster than any throne could control. Once people realized that authority could be questioned, the spell was broken forever. No dynasty could restore what had been lost, because the loss was not territorial or military, it was psychological.
The belief that one family could rule forever in the name of heaven no longer made sense. The Chinese Empire ended when its core promise, order through timeless hierarchy, could no longer answer the demands of a changing society. What followed was uncertainty, struggle, and reinvention, but also the emergence of a new understanding of power, one that recognized history as a force shaped by people, not destiny imposed from above.
As the 20th century unfolded, the memory of the empire became both a burden and a resource. Political leaders argued over how much of the imperial past should be rejected and how much could be repurposed. Some saw the empire as the root of weakness, blaming centuries of hierarchy for China's vulnerability to foreign powers. Others viewed it as a source of cultural strength, proof that unity and endurance were possible across vast lands and diverse peoples. This debate shaped every major decision. Efforts to modernize the military, economy, and education system were constantly measured against the fear of repeating imperial stagnation. Yet, removing imperial structures entirely proved impossible. The sheer scale of the country demanded coordination, and coordination required authority. The question was no longer whether China needed a center, but what kind of center could survive in a modern world. Revolutionary movements offered radical answers, promising to erase old loyalties and build a new society from the ground up. In practice, many of these movements adopted centralized control reminiscent of imperial governance, though justified by ideology rather than tradition. Symbols changed, rituals disappeared, but the logic of command remained familiar. This continuity reveals a deeper truth about why the empire fell. It was not destroyed solely by invaders or internal rebels, but by a mismatch between inherited systems and emerging realities. Technology, global trade, and mass communication demanded flexibility and rapid response. The imperial bureaucracy, designed for slow deliberation and moral consensus, could not adapt quickly enough. Even reforms came too late, constrained by fear of undermining authority. When the dynasty finally collapsed, the vacuum it left was filled by competing visions, each claiming to offer what the empire could not: strength without stagnation, unity without rigidity. Yet the shadow of the empire loomed over every experiment. Failures were judged harshly, successes cautiously, as society searched for a model that could replace centuries of dynastic rule. This long transition explains why the fall of the Chinese Empire feels unfinished. Its end did not conclude a story, it opened a chapter that continues to shape identity and politics. The empire's legacy lived on in language, customs, and expectations, influencing how people understood leadership and responsibility. Even resistance to authority was framed in terms inherited from the past, invoking moral duty and collective harmony. In this sense, the empire fell as a political institution, but survived as a cultural framework. The challenge for modern China became how to move beyond that framework without losing cohesion. This balancing act remains one of the most complex consequences of the empire's collapse. It shows that empires do not simply vanish, they dissolve into the societies they once ruled,
leaving behind patterns that endure long after the throne is gone. The Chinese Empire really fell when it could no longer contain the forces it had helped create: education that spread critical thought, administration that connected distant regions, and a shared culture that made people imagine alternatives to dynastic rule. Its greatest strength became the seed of its undoing, proving that the end of empire is often the beginning of something far more complicated than victory or defeat.
In the decades after the empire's collapse, China moved through cycles of upheaval that revealed how deeply imperial habits were embedded in everyday life. Land reforms, social campaigns, and political movements promised total transformation, yet each faced resistance not only from opposition groups but from ingrained ways of thinking. For centuries, people had been taught to see order as something imposed from above, legitimized by history and morality. Removing the emperor did not erase this expectation. Instead, it created uncertainty about who held the mandate of heaven, or whether such a mandate still existed at all. Competing factions claimed legitimacy through ideology, nationalism, or revolutionary purity, echoing earlier dynasties that justified rule through lineage or divine favor. This struggle for legitimacy slowed the creation of stable institutions. Authority shifted rapidly, sometimes violently, undermining trust in long-term governance. The empire's fall thus produced not immediate freedom, but a prolonged search for replacement structures. Economic pressures intensified this search. Population growth, resource scarcity, and global competition demanded efficiency and innovation. The imperial system had once managed these challenges through gradual adjustment, relying on local elites to maintain balance. Without that framework, central policies often clashed with regional realities. Local communities, long accustomed to negotiating with imperial officials, now faced abrupt directives that ignored tradition and custom. This tension fueled unrest and migration, reshaping the social landscape. At the same time, the memory of imperial unity continued to inspire efforts at national consolidation. Leaders invoked ancient history to rally support, presenting themselves as heirs to a long civilizational mission. This selective use of the past highlights another reason the empire fell. Its history became too powerful to abandon, yet too rigid to replicate. Every attempt to revive imperial authority risked repeating the mistakes that had led to collapse. Every attempt to reject it entirely risked fragmentation. The result was a constant oscillation between centralization and reform. Cultural identity further complicated this process. Literature, philosophy, and art carried imperial values forward even as political systems changed. Respect for hierarchy, emphasis on harmony, and moral responsibility remained central themes. These values helped maintain social cohesion during turbulent times, but also constrained dissent and innovation. The empire's influence persisted in how people related to power, often prioritizing stability over experimentation. This preference slowed adaptation to rapid global change, reinforcing the cycle of crisis and reform. By examining these patterns, it becomes clear that the Chinese empire really fell not at a single moment, but through a gradual erosion of relevance.
Its institutions could not keep pace with the scale and speed of modern challenges, and its moral framework struggled to accommodate new ideas of equality and participation. Yet its legacy endured because it had shaped a civilization, not just a state. The empire's fall was therefore incomplete, a transformation rather than an ending. Understanding this helps explain why modern China continues to wrestle with questions of authority, unity, and identity. The answers lie not only in recent history, but in centuries of imperial experience that still influence how power is imagined and exercised today.
The final lesson of how the Chinese Empire really fell lies not in battles lost or dynasties overthrown, but in the quiet realization that permanence itself can become a weakness. For centuries, the empire believed it had discovered the ultimate formula for human order, a balance so refined that it could endure forever. This belief shaped every decision, from governance to education, from family structure to the meaning of loyalty. Yet the world beyond China was changing faster than ever before. New technologies compressed distance, new ideas challenged inherited truths, and new forms of power emerged that did not depend on ritual or tradition. The imperial system, built to preserve continuity, found itself unable to respond without undermining its own foundations. Reform threatened legitimacy, and rigidity invited collapse. Caught between these forces, the empire slowly unraveled. Officials delayed decisive change, fearing chaos more than decay, while ordinary people sensed that the old order no longer protected them. Faith in the mandate of heaven weakened as floods, rebellions, and foreign domination piled upon one another without clear resolution. The emperor, once seen as the pivot of the cosmos, became distant, symbolic, and finally irrelevant. When the final dynasty fell, there was no dramatic end worthy of legend, only exhaustion and resignation. The empire ended because it could no longer answer the most basic question of power. Why should people continue to believe? What replaced it was not a clean break, but a long struggle to redefine authority in a world where tradition alone was no longer enough. Modern China inherited both the strengths and scars of this collapse. The emphasis on unity, discipline, and long-term thinking remains deeply rooted, as does the fear of fragmentation and disorder. These impulses can be traced directly to the memory of imperial fall, when division brought suffering and humiliation. At the same time, the desire to modernize, to control destiny rather than submit to it, reflects a rejection of the fatalism that once sustained imperial rule. The empire fell because it trusted history to repeat itself, because it believed the past guaranteed the future. The modern era proved otherwise. By understanding this, the fall of the Chinese Empire becomes more than a historical event. It becomes a warning. Civilizations do not end only through invasion or revolution, but through an inability to adapt their deepest beliefs to new realities. China survived the fall of its empire precisely because its culture was larger than its political system. Yet the shadow of that empire still lingers, shaping choices and anxieties in the present. To ask how the Chinese Empire really fell is to ask how any long-standing order must eventually confront change. The answer is never simple and never sudden. It unfolds slowly, through hesitation, compromise, and belief worn thin by time. And in that slow unraveling,
history leaves lessons not just for China, but for every civilization that believes itself eternal.